There is a dark idea that hangs over us, almost like an invisible shadow. When we think of hell, we imagine flames, demons, perhaps a world of pain that is far away, reserved for the worst of us. But what if I told you that the real hell has already begun, and we are all inside it? Yes, our reality, with all its complexities and pressures, traps us in a cycle of suffering, in ways we can barely perceive. Maybe hell is not made of fire, but of suffocating and repetitive days, of empty dreams, and of a routine that slowly consumes us. Now click like and subscribe to the channel. It will only take a second, and you will help us a lot. Each of us, at some point, has experienced the weight of a world that demands more than we can give. Waking up every day and living a life that sometimes seems to have no purpose can be, in some ways, a silent torment. And as we struggle to survive at this rate, we sink into a sense of despair, almost as if we were prisoners of an invisible sentence. This is everyday hell, a cycle where we are forced to continue without knowing exactly why or where we are going. It's a crueler version, as there is no fire, but there is an emptiness that burns inside. Just imagine, how many people do you know who live this way, sunk in a silence of discontent? They work, come home, and still feel trapped in a life that doesn't satisfy them. There is no respite, there is no true rest, because even sleep seems to be just another break to face the same cycle the next day. It's as if we are in an eternal repetition of days that wear us down and consume us. And so, without realizing it, we live inside an emotional and psychological prison where hope fades over time. What happens is that, stuck in this routine, we don't even stop to reflect on this reality. We can barely see that we are, in fact, trapped in a version of hell, a daily and silent hell. But don't worry, as we're going to explore every layer of this undercover prison. Understanding where we got lost is the first step to finding a way out. And maybe, just maybe, by understanding this process, we can see true freedom beyond these invisible chains. Since man began to question his existence, the idea of hell has always been part of the stories we tell each other. Each culture, each religion, has its own version of this place of torment. In ancient Greece, it was Tartarus. For the Egyptians, the underworld of Duat. In Christianity, hell is a place of eternal fire. These interpretations have evolved over time, reflecting our fear of suffering, loss, and the unknown. And, curiously, many of these versions carry the same essence, that of inescapable and eternal pain. Over the centuries, this concept changed and took new forms. The idea of hell is no longer just a physical punishment, becoming something deeper, psychological, something that doesn't need fire to exist. Our fears, our insecurities and anxieties have become the new torments. In modern society, many believe that hell is living without inner peace, being trapped in internal dilemmas that consume the soul. This invisible suffering is often even more intense than any physical pain, as it is a prison that we cannot see but feel every day. Think about how indigenous cultures, for example, see hell as an imbalance with nature and with oneself. For them, hell is not a distant place, but the result of living in disharmony, something that is within each person. This vision brings us an uncomfortable truth. Often, hell can be in our own choices, in our way of looking at life. The constant search for status, the attachment to materialism, the withdrawal from people. All of this can create our own internal hell, and we don't even realize it. This concept of psychological and emotional hell has expanded so much that many of us, without realizing it, carry this burden on a daily basis. When we look at our own history, perhaps it's time to reflect. Are we living in a modern version of hell, where the pain is uncertainty, comparisons, and daily demands? It is a torment that can only be felt, and the first key to getting out of it is understanding where we are. And so, we continue to understand other sides of this silent hell that surrounds us. For many, routine is like an invisible cell from which it is almost impossible to escape. We wake up, work, eat, and sleep, always following the same steps, as if we were trapped in a cycle that never ends. This repetition, which at first glance seems harmless, can turn into a form of slow torture, as the monotony hides the danger of becoming prisoners of a purposeless life. In the midst of this whirlwind of responsibilities, the brightness of existence fades, and what remains is an automatic existence, without color, without life. This type of arrest is so subtle that many don't even realize they are trapped. Work becomes the center of everything. Dreams are postponed, and life is reduced to a sequence of obligations. How many have asked themselves, am I living or just surviving? And in this survival, how many opportunities go unnoticed? How many experiences are left aside? Routine becomes a burden, as if we carry invisible chains that prevent us from moving forward, from experiencing something new and liberating. To escape this silent prison, it takes courage to break the cycle. It could be something small, like changing your route to work, taking an afternoon to do something that sparks joy, or even taking a few minutes to reflect on what really matters. We don't need big revolutions to challenge routine. Sometimes it's the small gestures that bring back the meaning of living. It's like opening a crack of light in a dark room, allowing life to enter our story again. But do we have that courage? Or are we so comfortable in our safety zone that we prefer to follow the beaten path, even if it leads to boredom and dissatisfaction? The hell of routine is made up of accommodation and fear of change. And it's this feeling of being trapped by something invisible that leads us to the next point. How loneliness can infiltrate even the most crowded places, creating a hell of isolation where there shouldn't be. In a world where we are always just a click away, loneliness has never been more present. Social media has created an illusion of closeness, but in reality, many feel more isolated than ever. Every like, every message seems to connect, but behind the screen, there is a void that cannot be filled with notifications. The search for virtual validation takes us away from true human contact, and, in this false connection, we lose who we really are, creating an abyss between what we show and what we feel. Loneliness in a crowd is a cruel reality. How many times do we look around and feel that no one really sees us, that we are invisible among familiar faces? We talk to colleagues, we answer messages, but when night falls, the silence seems to weigh more heavily than before. It's the kind of loneliness that doesn't depend on physical presence, but on the lack of genuine connection. The one that only happens when someone really listens to us, understands us, and, above all, cares. And how many can say they have this in their lives? For many, this loneliness becomes a silent hell as it eats away at them from within, slowly and steadily. We create walls, we keep up appearances, and we become more and more closed off. Some try to fill this void with distractions, series, music, work, but deep down, they know that none of this replaces a hug, an understanding look, a sincere conversation. Reconnecting with the real world can be scary, but it's the first step to overcoming this suffocating loneliness. Is the solution to this loneliness in our own hands? Maybe it's the courage to open up, to leave the virtual world and seek real connections. But the fear of rejection is strong, and it ends up keeping us trapped in this comfortable but unbearable loneliness. And so, we enter another aspect of this modern hell, the pressure of appearance and success, which holds us to unattainable standards and continues to feed our emptiness. We live in a time where being successful and beautiful has become an obligation, almost a sentence. Social media bombards us daily with images of sculptural bodies, perfect lives, extraordinary achievements, an edited reality that forces us to believe that we are always falling short. And so, the invisible hell of comparison arises, where each of us becomes a prisoner of an impossible quest, a game where the finish line is never reached. This wears down the mind, undermines self-esteem, and creates a void that consumes our essence. The pressure to fit into these standards is so intense that we often forget who we really are. How many people have looked in the mirror and questioned whether that reflection represents who they want to be or just what the world expects of them? In a world that idolizes beauty and success, authenticity becomes a rare currency and, for many, impossible to maintain. The incessant search for external approval turns our lives into an exhibition where genuine satisfaction gives way to the need to be accepted. It's easy to say, accept yourself as you are, but in practice, this task seems monumental. The path to freeing yourself from this hell of expectations begins with small steps, such as learning to value yourself for the achievements that really matter and embracing your imperfections. Imagine exchanging the validation of a like for moments that nourish the soul. A real conversation, a pause to reflect, a time to explore your talents without the pressure of pleasing others. Small gestures that give you back control over who you are, regardless of what the world dictates. However, this search for authenticity is a lonely road, where each step requires courage to challenge what seems unquestionable. After all, society continues to judge, demand, and it is difficult to stand firm when standards continue to point the finger. But perhaps it is in this confrontation with other people's judgment that we begin to understand another type of slavery, less visible but equally destructive: consumerism, which makes us believe that having more is the solution to any and all emptiness. In today's society, consumption has become almost a religion, and we, its faithful devotees, blindly follow the promise that having more is the path to happiness. The market seduces us with products that promise to fill our voids, but in reality, this satisfaction is as fleeting as it is ephemeral. We buy clothes, gadgets, objects of desire, and yet that feeling of fulfillment never arrives. It's like trying to quench your thirst with salt water. The more we drink, the thirstier we feel. This cycle of consumption generates an existential void that deepens. With each purchase, we believe that we are closer to achieving a better life, but the reality is that we are just moving away from ourselves. We overload ourselves with things, and over time, we are overcome by restlessness. The emptiness that we try to hide with new objects persists, and in the end, we realize that the material does not fill the soul. It's a modern hell, working to buy, buying to forget, and in the end, feeling more lost than before. Breaking this slavery requires a type of courage that few are willing to face. It doesn't mean giving up consumption, but questioning what we really need. Imagine exchanging an afternoon of shopping for an experience that touches the soul. A walk in a park, a real conversation, a book that inspires. These are the moments that truly fulfill us, that remind us of what it means to live, and that go beyond any material pleasure. Small steps that free us from an invisible prison, returning meaning to our existence. But society tells us otherwise. It encourages us to buy more and live according to what we acquire. And when we realize how deep we are in this cycle, revolt arises. After all, why do we have so much and feel so little? And it is at this point that the next burden reveals itself: the weight of inequality and injustice that spreads, making the world even more unbalanced and cruel for many. We live in a world where inequality screams before our eyes, where many have so much, while others barely have the basics to survive. This disparity surrounds us daily, whether in the news, on the streets, or even on social media. Seeing someone suffering, struggling to support themselves, and not being able to do anything about it is a torment for those who still have empathy. This feeling of powerlessness in the face of injustice creates a hell of its own, where we feel small and unable to change what is wrong around us. Injustice, in turn, is not just a question of lack of resources, but of equity, of giving everyone what is rightfully theirs. How can we accept that some live in excess while others go hungry? For many, this inequality becomes a wound, a constant discomfort that challenges our sense of humanity. This awakens a silent revolt, a feeling that we are being consumed by a flawed system. And yet, we often feel voiceless, without the means to combat this painful reality. It is difficult, however, to live in this hell of inequality and not become insensitive. Many try to block this feeling of helplessness by looking away, pretending that inequality is not their problem. But is ignoring this pain the solution? Imagine if, instead, each of us could make a small gesture, donate time, resources, or even our own voice to help those in need. These are simple acts, but when done with empathy, they carry transformative power. After all, what is justice if not the union of those who still believe in humanity? But this burden of inequality and injustice is just one layer of modern hell. And, in the midst of this scenario, the pain deepens with another type of torment that grows silently. Mental disorders, anxiety and depression, the invisible demons of our time, spread like an epidemic, affecting millions and making each day a silent battle. In silence, anxiety and depression have become the great torments of our age. They are invisible demons that attack without warning, stealing peace and transforming everyday life into an incessant struggle. Anxiety puts us in a state of constant alert, as if we were always on the edge of a cliff, about to fall. Depression pulls us into a dark abyss, where even the simplest tasks seem unbearable. This emotional hell does not need flames. It consumes slowly, invisible to the eyes of others. The modern world, with its demands and pressures, has fueled these disorders. In search of recognition, we are encouraged not to stop, to never rest, as if pausing were a sign of weakness. And at this rate, many reach their limits, out of breath, exhausted. Those who suffer from these demons often carry the burden in silence, afraid of the stigma and incomprehension of others. But this silent suffering cannot be ignored. It is real, and its pain is as intense as any physical suffering. It is possible to lighten this burden even if the path is arduous. Small steps, such as practicing meditation, moments of reflection, or seeking professional help, can make a big difference. Imagine taking a few minutes a day to breathe, disconnect from external expectations, and focus on your own well-being. These are simple attitudes that help create a space of inner peace, even when the world seems to be falling apart. These moments of self-care are, in fact, gestures of resistance against the invisible torment of the mind. However, for many, seeking help is still taboo, and the fear of judgment continues to imprison them. And, in this scenario, where appearance matters so much, suffering is often hidden behind fake smiles and rehearsed publications. Thus, we move on to another modern hell, the world of appearances and falsehood, where social media amplifies the pressure to appear happy, even if the soul is in pieces. In times of social media, the pressure to look happy has become true hell. We create a facade to show the world, a version of ourselves that always seems perfect, fulfilled, and happy. But behind this digital mask, many face internal battles, doubts, and insecurities that no one sees. It's like living in a play where everyone pretends, and the truth is lost between filters and rehearsed smiles. The appearance society imprisons us, creating an abyss between who we are and what we show ourselves to be. This culture of falsehood and superficiality is exhausting. The incessant search for validation keeps us trapped in a constant need for other people's approval. Each like, each comment seems to give a momentary meaning, but the feeling of emptiness returns with even more force. How often do people post happy moments to prove something to themselves or others? And how often do they feel lonely right after? This disconnect between the real and the virtual turns life into an endless and exhausting competition. To escape this cycle of appearances, it takes courage to be authentic. Imagine if, instead of seeking perfection, everyone shared their real experiences, their weaknesses, and imperfections. This would open space for true connections, for a less superficial and more compassionate society. Being true to yourself is the first step to a fuller and more satisfying life. Small attitudes of authenticity can be a breath of fresh air in the midst of the suffocating world of falsehood, like a door that opens for those who seek the real. But this quest for authenticity is challenging in a world that insists on controlling every move. Technology, which could be an ally, ends up imprisoning, monitoring, and dictating how we should act. And it is in this scenario that we enter the next modern hell. The dark side of technology and surveillance, where every step is watched, and the feeling of freedom is just an illusion. Technology, which promised so much to free us, also imprisons us in subtle and disturbing ways. We live in an era of constant surveillance, where our every step, our every word, and even our most intimate interests are monitored and recorded. Our devices, which bring convenience and connection, have become tools that track our movements, control what we see, and influence what we think. This invisible control creates a new kind of prison, where freedom is an illusion, and our privacy slowly dissolves. It's hard to imagine that something as everyday as a cell phone or computer can capture us in such a powerful way. How many times are we manipulated without realizing it, with algorithms that shape our behavior, that show us what we should see and believe? Technology, which should make life easier, ends up limiting us, pushing us into information bubbles that reinforce our beliefs, isolating us from diversity and truth. This is the hell of silent manipulation, where we become prisoners of a reality that is not always real. For some, the feeling of being monitored is frightening. Knowing that every click, every purchase, and every search is tracked creates constant discomfort. It's like living in a city of glass, where we are always watched, but we never know who is watching. There are ways to minimize this surveillance. Control app permissions, use safer browsers, limit sharing of personal information. These are small measures that can offer a sense of privacy, even in the midst of a sea of invisible eyes. But this battle against surveillance is just one part of the bigger picture. Because, beyond digital control, there is another invisible demon lurking: fear, violence, which turns the world into an increasingly hostile place. And so, we move on to another level of this modern hell: the cycle of violence and fear, which makes us question how far we can trust others and live fully. The world around us seems increasingly taken over by violence and fear, transforming everyday life into a kind of emotional minefield. With each news of violence and tragedy, our sense of security fragments a little more, creating a constant state of alert. Many live in silent fear, always afraid to leave the house, walk down unfamiliar streets, or even open the door to a stranger. This cycle of fear imprisons us, leading to a limited life where freedom is replaced by caution and fear. This constant fear affects us deeply, undermining our trust in others and distorting our view of the world. Distrust becomes our daily companion, distancing us from others, isolating us within a bubble of insecurity. Each unknown person becomes viewed with suspicion, and healthy coexistence is sacrificed in the name of a false sense of protection. It is a hell that imposes itself subtly, moving us away from the true human essence, that of living in community and trusting others. Overcoming this fear is not simple, but there are ways to deal with it. Reconnecting with reality, instead of living immersed in alarming news, is a good start. Spending more time with people who make us feel safe, seeking out activities that make us feel free and at peace, such as walking in nature, can be antidotes to this spiral of fear. Every gesture that strengthens our sense of security is a way of rebuilding our confidence, of freeing ourselves from this psychological imprisonment. However, the world does not make this task easy. We live in a time where global crises and uncertainties are always lurking, increasing tension and fear in an almost palpable way. And so, with this feeling of instability always present, we are led to question whether there is any space for peace in such a troubled scenario. And it is at this point that we enter the next aspect of this modern hell: global crises and the weight of uncertainty, which overwhelm our minds and erode our tranquility. We live in times of constant uncertainty, where each new crisis seems to shake the foundations of our tranquility. Pandemics, economic crises, climate disasters, political tensions. It's as if we are always on the edge of an abyss. This feeling that the world is collapsing creates an invisible weight on our shoulders, making each day a battle against the fear of the unknown. This is a silent anguish, a mental torment that infiltrates our thoughts, robbing us of our peace and leaving us at the mercy of incessant anxiety. The impact of these global crises goes far beyond the news. It is reflected in our choices, our relationships, and even the way we see the future. Many live in constant fear of losing their job, of seeing the price of things rise, of facing new restrictions. The feeling that everything can change overnight is exhausting, undermining our ability to plan and dream. This is a hell where there is no stability, where the ground always seems ready to collapse, and where we feel powerless in the face of forces greater than us. Despite the gloomy scenario, there are ways to deal with this uncertainty. Adopting a more flexible stance, learning to adapt, and valuing the present are attitudes that can bring some relief. Focusing on what is within our reach, such as taking care of our mental health and strengthening our bonds, is a way of creating a safety zone in the midst of chaos. Practicing detachment, reducing the consumption of negative news, and seeking balance are tools for maintaining sanity in an unpredictable world. But living in this constant adaptation is not easy, especially when, in addition to global crises, we are pressured by expectations that weigh on our shoulders. Expectations from society, from family, from ourselves, that demand unattainable perfection from us. And it is at this point that we dive into yet another layer of this modern hell: guilt and the weight of social expectations, which transform every failure into a reason for personal torment. From an early age, we are shaped by expectations that seem to whisper in our ears what we should be, achieve. Society, family, friends. Everyone has an idea of what would be right for us, an ideal that is often impossible to fulfill. This weight of expectations becomes a burden that accompanies us with each decision, generating guilt when we do not reach the ideal standard. It's as if we are always indebted to something or someone, as if our happiness depends on being perfect in the eyes of others. Guilt then becomes a lingering shadow. Every choice, every failure, every moment of rest carries an invisible judgment. Did I do enough? Am I where I'm supposed to be? These questions echo in our minds, feeding a feeling of inadequacy, that we will never be good enough. This constant pressure is a kind of mental hell, an inner voice that tells us over and over that we are not yet worthy, that we still lack something to be accepted and loved. Finding relief from this torment requires courage to challenge these voices and embrace what truly matters to us. Imagine if, instead of following what is expected of you, You could define your own path, respect your limits, and recognize your own achievements. This is a process of liberation that begins with forgiving yourself, with accepting that mistakes are part of growth. Seeking your own satisfaction and not the approval of others is a way of breaking these invisible chains that bind us. But the path to self-acceptance is not simple, especially when time seems to slip out of our hands. As we age, the fear of not having met our goals intensifies, and life becomes a race against time. And so, we move on to yet another layer of this modern hell. The agony of escaping time. The feeling that time is an implacable enemy that prevents us from achieving everything we want. Time is relentless, a clock that never stops, even when we want it to slow down. As the years pass, many begin to feel that time is a silent enemy, something that slips through our fingers without us being able to control it. We look back and realize that there are things we stopped doing, dreams that fell by the wayside, opportunities that never come back. This feeling of urgency, that we are running against time, creates an anguish that accompanies us with each birthday, with each life milestone. This race against time makes us hostage to our own expectations. We try to accomplish everything at once, fearing that tomorrow will never come. And this leads us to a life of rush and anxiety. We feel like we need to achieve success, start a family, have a brilliant career, all in record time. But, in this rush, we end up forgetting to live in the present, to appreciate the simple moments that are often the ones that bring the most happiness. And so, life goes on, and dissatisfaction grows. To alleviate this agony, we need to learn to value the present, to give meaning to what we do now. Taking moments to reflect, to connect with what really matters, can bring peace in the midst of the rush. Imagine if you could look at the now and find satisfaction in what you have already accomplished, instead of always looking to the distant future. The practice of gratitude, of moments of pause, is a way of giving meaning to the time that seems to slip away. Every second, when lived fully, has the power to free us from this incessant anxiety. But even with this shift in perspective, the fear of wasting time never fully disappears. And, for some, excessive empathy, the habit of carrying other people's suffering, ends up adding even more weight to that load. We then enter another layer of this modern hell, the dark side of excessive empathy, which binds us to other people's pain and prevents us from living in peace. Empathy is an admirable quality, an ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes and feel their pain. But in excess, it can become an almost unbearable burden. Those who feel too much about the suffering of others often carry an emotional burden that is not theirs, absorbing anguish and sadness as if they were part of themselves. It's as if someone else's pain infiltrates your heart, becoming a constant weight, a burden that won't be lifted. This excessive empathy ends up imprisoning, creating a silent hell where peace itself is sacrificed. Living in deep feelings for others can lead to emotional exhaustion, a state of exhaustion where it is difficult to distinguish where the other's suffering ends and where ours begins. This invisible weight manifests itself in sleepless nights, incessant thoughts, and consuming worry. Anyone who has ever found themselves unable to disconnect from the difficulties of someone close to them understands this feeling well. It's as if every story of pain, every tear, is recorded, becoming yet another layer of personal torment. To find balance, you need to learn to establish healthy emotional boundaries. Having empathy does not mean carrying the weight of the world, but offering support without getting lost in the other person's pain. Imagine, for example, the difference between listening carefully and absorbing problems as if they were your own. This exercise in detachment is essential for anyone who wants to help, without sacrificing themselves. Practicing activities that recharge your energy, such as meditation or sports, can be a breath of fresh air. a way of rediscovering your own essence and not drowning in the sadness around you. But this balancing practice is challenging, as we cling to this responsibility of caring for others, often without realizing that we are hurting ourselves in the process. And, in the midst of this, there is a feeling of imprisonment in a false freedom, the price we pay for autonomy in a society full of expectations and limits. And so, we dive into another layer of this modern hell, the paradox of freedom and autonomy, where each choice seems to trap us even more. Freedom is an ideal that we all seek, but, paradoxically, it also brings a series of responsibilities and burdens that few are prepared to carry. In a society that values autonomy above all else, the ability to make choices seems like a blessing, until the moment we find ourselves overwhelmed by them. Each decision, each path, represents a renunciation, a no to all other possibilities, and this need to continually choose can become a personal hell, a prison created by too much freedom. We live in a time where options are limitless, from careers to lifestyles, but this abundance of possibilities also brings the anguish of indecision. How many times do we hesitate, ponder, and suffer in fear of making the wrong choice? The price of freedom is the weight of regret, of doubt, of the fear that something better could have been chosen. It's the torment of looking at what's left behind and imagining how life could be different, but never knowing for sure. To escape this cycle of anguish, it is necessary to cultivate confidence in your own decisions and accept that there is no perfect choice. True freedom perhaps lies in the ability to commit to what we choose, rather than getting lost in endless what-ifs. Small exercises of gratitude for the choices we have made, such as reflecting on the benefits and learnings of each path followed, can bring peace. This commitment to our decisions allows us to live more lightly, without carrying the weight of what is left behind. But even when finding this peace, a lack of purpose continues to be a challenge for many. After all, what's the point of freedom if we don't know what to do with it? And so, we move on to yet another layer of this modern hell. The feeling of lack of purpose, where freedom without direction becomes an existential void that consumes and disorients. For many, the feeling of purposelessness is like a void that never fills, a silently echoing question: why am I here? We live in a world that demands fulfillment and meaning, but at the same time seems to offer little guidance on how to find them. The search for purpose becomes a lonely path, full of uncertainty, where each step seems to take us further away from a concrete answer. And in this scenario, life turns into a succession of dull days, where nothing seems to make sense. This existential void is a consuming torment, and the lack of purpose makes each activity monotonous, colorless. Even moments of achievement and happiness seem incomplete, because, without a greater meaning, everything loses its value. Imagine life as a puzzle without a final picture. The pieces are there, but without a goal, you lack the motivation to put them together. Many try to fill this gap with work and relationships, but in the end, the feeling of incompleteness persists. Finding purpose requires a journey of self-knowledge and courage to question what really matters. It could be something small, like helping someone close to you, taking up a hobby that brings you genuine joy, or pursuing a project that truly inspires. These small actions help us to envision a personal purpose, something that does not depend on other people's expectations, but on an internal desire. When purpose comes from within, it brings a sense of peace and direction, transforming everyday life into a fuller and more meaningful experience. But this search is not always easy, and many are still stuck in the past, questioning the decisions that brought them here. And so, another layer of this modern hell reveals itself: the burden of carrying the past, of reliving traumas and regrets that continue to hold us back and prevent us from moving towards a lighter future. The past is like a shadow that accompanies us, and for many, it weighs more than they should carry. Traumas, mistakes, regrets, they all accumulate into emotional baggage that over time becomes difficult to bear. Each painful memory is a constant reminder of moments that we would like to erase, but that insist on remaining, like invisible ghosts that pull us back. This burden of the past turns the present into a struggle, a battle to find peace amid memories that never go away. The pain of carrying the past is often in the details. A nasty comment, a wrong decision, a dream that never came true. These memories seem small, but together they create a weight that is difficult to ignore. How many have felt the desire to go back in time and do things differently? This desire, however, only deepens the anguish, as we know that the past cannot be changed. It's a kind of hell where we relive our own mistakes, fueling a guilt that never seems to dissipate. Freeing yourself from this burden requires a process of acceptance and forgiveness. It's not about forgetting, but about learning to see the past as a part of who we are, and not as a prison that defines our future. Practices such as writing about painful memories, seeking therapeutic help, or even venting to someone you trust are ways of giving new meaning to these memories. By recognizing the past and leaving it in its rightful place, we begin to find lightness and space for the new. But for many, this process of liberation is difficult, as there is always the fear that the people around us will hurt us again. And so, we move on to another silent torment in this modern hell: the fragility of human relationships, where the fear of betrayal and loss prevents us from truly trusting and opening up. Human relationships are like delicate threads, which easily break at the slightest sign of distrust or hurt. We live in a time where connections seem superficial, where intimacy is replaced by the need to keep up appearances. This fear of trusting completely turns relationships into a minefield, where every step can be a risk. The result is a silent loneliness, a feeling that, even when surrounded by people, we are truly alone, unable to fully open up. The fragility of bonds manifests itself in many ways. Friendships that fall apart for no reason, romantic relationships that end due to insecurity, and even family ties that become distant over time. Every breakup, every betrayal is a wound that leaves scars and reinforces the idea that trust is dangerous. Over time, we build emotional walls, protecting ourselves from pain, but also keeping us from true connections. This is the hell of fragile relationships, where uncertainty and the fear of losing prevent love from blossoming. To cultivate strong relationships requires vulnerability, an act of courage that few are willing to perform. Imagine, for example, the difference that an honest and open dialogue can make, where each person feels safe to express their fears and desires. Small gestures of trust, such as showing support and understanding, help strengthen bonds and create an environment where relationships can grow healthily. It is the daily practice of being true that builds a solid bond, proof against the challenges that arise. But this striving for deep relationships is often threatened by our obsession with control. We want everything to be predictable, safe, but life is naturally uncertain, and it is this incessant need to control every aspect of existence that leads us to another aspect of this modern hell: the illusion of control and constant frustration, where the desire for predictability traps us in a cycle of disappointments. The quest for control is a trap we all fall into at some point. We want to ensure that everything goes according to plan, that our choices lead exactly to the expected result. However, life is unpredictable, and the feeling of control is, most of the time, an illusion. This incessant desire to control every detail creates a cycle of frustration and disappointment, as reality often confronts us with the unexpected. This is a modern torment, the attempt to shape the world around us, only to discover that it is untamable. Frustration arises when our expectations do not align with reality. How many times have we meticulously planned something only to have it turn out completely differently? Every failure, every deviation from what we imagined, makes us question our decisions, generating a cycle of self-criticism. This quest for absolute control turns even the smallest failures into major disappointments. We live in a constant state of tension, as if we always have to be prepared for the next unpleasant surprise. Achieving peace in this regard requires a change in perspective, an understanding that we do not have the power to control everything, and that this is part of life. Practices such as acceptance and flexibility are essential for dealing with the unexpected. Imagine, for example, the peace of mind of accepting that not every day will be perfect, and that some challenges are beyond our reach. This is an act of liberation, a way of living more lightly, without the need to ensure that everything goes according to plan. But this surrender to the unknown is not easy, as we have been trained to believe that happiness depends on having control over our lives. And, in this search for control, we also end up believing that happiness is a destiny, an eternal achievement. This is the next point of this modern hell, the desperate search for happiness, which turns life into an endless race for something that always seems to escape. Happiness has become a supreme goal, something we need to achieve at any cost. We are constantly surrounded by messages that tell us that we should be happy, fulfilled, and always happy with life. And in this incessant race, happiness becomes a distant ideal, a goal that always seems to be just beyond our reach. This uncontrolled desire to be happy all the time creates an invisible torment, as each moment of sadness or frustration is seen as a personal failure, something that needs to be corrected at any cost. The idea that we should constantly be happy leads us on an endless search. We try new hobbies, new diets, new lifestyles, always looking for that something that will finally bring us ultimate happiness. But this momentary satisfaction soon disappears, and the cycle begins again. The truth is, when we chase happiness as a prize, we forget that it is made up of small moments, not one big achievement. It's like trying to capture water with your hands. The more you squeeze, the more it escapes. To escape this exhausting cycle, we need to give new meaning to what we understand as happiness. Instead of looking for it as a goal to be achieved, we can learn to value the simple moments, to find satisfaction in what we already have. Imagine the peace of accepting that life is made up of ups and downs, and that we don't always need to be euphorically happy. The practice of gratitude and mindfulness, being present in the here and now, is a way to feel the true value of each moment, without the pressure of achieving a state of constant joy. But society still pushes us towards this incessant search, and we often get stuck in this cycle of dissatisfaction. It's time to stop and reflect. Could it be that hell lies in always wanting more, without ever appreciating what we already have? And this is where the naked truth reveals itself, because perhaps, by facing all these torments, we can finally understand what really imprisons us. And so we reach the last point of this path, the conclusion about modern hell and the possibility of transformation. After going through all these layers, it becomes clear that hell is not only a place of eternal suffering, but also a mental and emotional state created by human beings themselves. The real hell can be in our own choices, in the pressures we accept, in the fears we feed. We live in a world that imposes expectations and ideals on us that, when not met, become sources of torment. This modern hell is a set of silent pains, invisible prisons that we accept without question, simply because we were taught to live that way. But there is a way out, a way to break these chains and transform our worldview. This transformation begins within each of us, with the understanding that life is imperfect and full of ups and downs. By recognizing that suffering is part of the human experience, we can find relief. Freeing yourself from this hell involves accepting limitations, valuing simple moments, and embracing who we are, with all our imperfections. This acceptance frees us from the weight of unattainable perfection, allowing us to live in a lighter and more truthful way. With each challenge overcome, with each mental prison broken, we take a step out of this hell. Question your beliefs, review your expectations, and look for what really matters to you, not to others. The path to inner peace involves the courage to be authentic, to live for yourself, and not for the world. By freeing yourself from the chains of fear and expectation, life becomes a space of freedom, where hell is just a distant memory, a phase that taught us to value what really matters. So, I ask you, what are you waiting for to start this transformation? Are you ready to free yourself from this invisible hell and live a fulfilling life? If this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue learning about what really makes life worth living. Together, we can build an existence with more meaning and inner peace.
If you're interested in having a Bible like the one we use in our studies, check out the link in the first pinned comment. If you enjoy our content and can support our channel, consider buying us a coffee through Buy Me a Coffee. Additionally, if you can purchase a crucifix, we also have a link in the first pinned comment. We greatly appreciate your support. God bless and see you in the next video.